The laboratory smelled of ozone and old coffee, the kind of midnight quiet that detectives learned to distrust. Somewhere in the lower levels of an experimental research facility, a temporal field generator hummed at a frequency just beyond human hearing. Technicians stood behind reinforced glass, their faces lit by the soft blue glow of containment monitors. They were not expecting trouble. They had run the simulation 47 times without incident. But trouble, as any seasoned officer will tell you, rarely waits for an invitation. Alex Murphy was not supposed to be there. He had followed a lead, a quiet tip about stolen prototype components, a trail of paperwork that led him through 3 precincts and into a warehouse that was not a warehouse at all. By the time he understood what he was looking at, the field had already begun to destabilize. Warning lights painted the walls in pulses of red. A voice from a speaker tried to issue an evacuation order, but the words dissolved into static. And then the worlds tore open. There was no sound. That was the strangest part. A man who had survived gunfire, explosions, and the slow mechanical agony of his own resurrection expected noise at the end of things. Instead, there was only light, white and absolute, folding around him like a tide. He felt his servos lock. He felt the weight of his armor become weightless. And then, for what might have been a heartbeat or 100 years, he felt nothing at all. When his systems rebooted, the silence was different. It was the silence of a room that had been built for calm. He was lying on a smooth, pale floor beneath a ceiling that curved gently overhead, and the air carried the faint, clean scent of recycled atmosphere. Diagnostic routines scrolled across his vision. No critical damage. No ammunition expended. Location unknown. Date unknown. Jurisdiction unknown. He rose slowly, the familiar whir of his joints sounding strangely loud in this quiet place. A window stretched along one wall, and through it he saw something his memory could not classify. Not the smudged, polluted stars of a Detroit sky, but a vast, deep field of them, sharp and endless. And among those stars, a curve of blue and green that could only be a planet, seen from somewhere it had no business being seen from. For a long moment, Murphy did not move. His processors searched for a rational explanation. A simulation. A hallucination. A malfunction in the visual cortex of his organic remnants. But the data did not lie. The instruments embedded in his frame confirmed gravity, atmosphere, temperature. Wherever he was, it was real. A door slid open without a sound, and figures entered. They wore uniforms he did not recognize, in colors that seemed almost too clean for a working environment. They did not draw weapons. They did not shout. One of them, a woman with steady eyes and an insignia he had never seen, raised her hands in a gesture of peace and spoke to him in plain, careful English. She told him he was safe. She told him he was aboard a Federation vessel. She told him the year and the number meant nothing to him at first, until it did. And something inside his chest that was still capable of feeling went very still. Murphy listened. He always listened first. And that was how good officers stayed alive. They told him about a civilization that had outgrown hunger, outgrown poverty, outgrown the corporate fiefdoms that had once carved his own city into private kingdoms. They told him humanity had reached the stars, and that the stars had not destroyed them. They told him there was no Detroit anymore, not the one he remembered. There was something else now, something better. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt the slow, familiar tightening of a cop on a quiet street that has gone too quiet. Because Murphy had spent a lifetime learning a single, unshakable truth. Wherever there are people, there is desire. Wherever there is desire, there is power. And wherever there is power, sooner or later there is someone willing to break the rules to keep it. He looked through the window at the gentle curve of a world that called itself perfect, and he did not believe it. Not yet. Not entirely. Somewhere out there, he knew, something was already wrong. They gave him a room with a window. That alone told him something about the people who had found him. In his own time, a man like him, a machine wrapped around the ruins of a murdered officer, would have been kept in a vault, studied, deactivated, restarted, perhaps disassembled for parts. Here, they gave him a chair he did not need, a bed he could not use, and a window that looked out onto the slow turning of a galaxy. The captain came to see him personally. That, too, was unexpected. In Murphy's experience, command did not visit the strange and the broken. Command sent subordinates with clipboards. But this captain sat across from him without ceremony, without fear, and asked him simple questions. Who he had been, what he remembered, what he believed. Murphy answered carefully. He had learned, long ago, to measure his words the way a marksman measures distance. But the captain listened without interruption, and when Murphy was finished, the captain did not flinch from what he had heard. He only nodded, slowly, and said that the crew would help him understand this new century if he was willing to learn. The crew came in waves. A doctor who examined his systems with a quiet wonder, the way a scholar might handle an artifact from a forgotten dynasty. An engineer who asked with genuine excitement how his power core had survived so many decades. A young officer who simply wanted to shake his hand because she had read about him in a history file and could not believe he was real. Some of them looked at him and saw history. Others looked at him and saw tragedy. Murphy felt both gazes equally, and neither offended him. He had stopped being offended by how people saw him a long time ago. What unsettled him was something else. It was the way these people spoke about conflict. They spoke of it the way a doctor speaks of a disease that has been mostly cured, with caution, with respect, but without the daily dread he had carried in his bones for as long as he could remember. They spoke of diplomacy first, of understanding first, of force only when every other door had been closed and locked from the other side. In Murphy's world, force had been the first door, not the last. Justice had worn body armor and carried a sidearm. Justice had kicked in doors at 3 a.m. Justice had been necessary because the system that should have produced it had been sold, piece by piece, to the highest bidder. He had been the proof of that sale, the receipt written in steel and grafted skin. Here, justice wore a different face. He watched a junior officer mediate a dispute between 2 engineers over a contested design without ever raising her voice. He watched a transport pilot speak to a frightened refugee in 3 languages until the refugee began to smile. He watched a security team disarm an intruder without firing a single shot, and afterward sit with him and ask him why he had come. Murphy did not know what to do with what he was seeing. A part of him, the older part, the part that still remembered being a man with a wife and a son and a future, wanted to believe it. Wanted to believe that humanity had finally learned. That the long, ugly century he had been born into had not been the shape of things forever, but only a stage, a wound that had eventually closed. Another part of him, the part that had been welded into him along with the armor, knew better than to trust a quiet street. He stood at his window that night, watching the slow drift of stars, and he asked himself a question he had not asked in many years. He asked whether it was possible. Whether humanity, his humanity, the same fragile, greedy, brilliant species he had bled for, could truly have grown into this. And for the first time he allowed himself, very quietly, to hope that the answer might be yes. The first report came in during the 3rd week of his stay. A small colony at the edge of an outer sector had lost contact with a research outpost. The outpost had been studying mineral compositions on an uninhabited moon. There had been 7 scientists, 2 technicians, and a single supply pilot. When a relief ship arrived, the station was intact. The equipment was undamaged. The logs were complete, but the people were gone. There was no sign of struggle. No bodies, no blood. Only a meal half-eaten in the common area and a single coffee cup still warm enough to suggest that whatever had happened only minutes before the relief ship had arrived. The investigation called it a mystery. Murphy called it a crime. He was not, officially, part of any investigation. He was a guest, a curiosity, a man out of his proper century. But the captain had begun, gently, to ask his opinion on certain matters. Matters where the Federation's instincts, refined by generations of peace, did not quite know where to look. Murphy's instincts, refined by generations of something else entirely, knew exactly where to look. He asked for the logs. He asked for the supply records. He asked for the names of every ship that had passed within range of that moon in the last 6 months, and the names of every cargo manifest that had been signed off without inspection. He was given everything he asked for, without hesitation, and that too told him something. In his time, that level of access would have required a warrant in a small war with 3 different bureaucracies. Here, the door simply opened. He worked slowly. He did not have the urgency of a man with a deadline. He had something better. He had the patience of a man who had once spent 1,000 quiet nights cataloging the small lies that powerful people tell. He read the manifests line by line. He cross-referenced shipping routes. He watched the timestamps, and after a few days, he began to see it. There was a pattern. It was very small. It was very careful. A handful of cargo shipments had passed near 3 separate worlds where similar disappearances had been quietly logged and quietly forgotten. The shipments were always legal. The paperwork was always immaculate. The captains were always reputable. But the timing, when you laid it out across a map of the sector, was just a little too convenient, a little too rhythmic. The way a heartbeat is rhythmic when you know how to listen for one. He brought his findings to the captain. The captain, to his credit, did not dismiss him. But the captain did say carefully that the Federation had encountered similar coincidences before, and that they had usually turned out to be the work of foreign intelligence services. Probing. The kind of pressure that interstellar neighbors sometimes applied to one another in the quiet spaces between formal treaties. Murphy listened. He nodded. He did not argue. And then he asked a single question. He asked who profited. The captain paused. Espionage, the captain explained, was rarely about profit. It was about leverage, about information, about long games played by patient governments. Murphy said quietly that in his experience the patient ones were almost never governments. Governments were loud. Governments were clumsy. The patient ones, the truly patient ones, were always the people who had something to sell and a reason to make sure no one saw them selling it. He was not accusing the Federation of being blind. He was suggesting gently that the Federation had been looking up at the borders, at the rival powers, at the great chessboard of stars, while someone somewhere beneath their feet had been very quietly looking down, threading a needle through the cracks of a system that trusted its own people, building something in the dark and the small spaces where no honest officer thought to shine a light. Murphy intended to be that light. The deeper he looked, the more familiar the shadows became. That was the part that troubled him. Not the horror of what he was finding, but the recognition of it. He had seen this shape before. He had seen it in the boardrooms of a city that no longer existed, in the polished smiles of executives who had owned police precincts the way other men owned restaurants. He had seen it written in the fine print of contracts that had bought and sold the bodies of officers like him. And now he was seeing it again, hundreds of years later, wearing different clothes, speaking a different language, but moving with the same old hunger. The trail led him to a name. The name led him to a shell company. The shell company led him to a research consortium that did not, on paper, exist. And the consortium led him, at last, to a small private station orbiting a world the Federation had largely forgotten, a world whose only export was supposed to be agricultural samples and academic papers. What he found there was neither. He found laboratories. He found rows of surgical tables polished and waiting. He found cybernetic components stacked in crates, components that should not have existed, that violated 6 Federation laws about the limits of acceptable enhancement. He found neural interfaces designed to override consent, sold quietly to clients whose names had been encrypted 3 times over. And he found in a sealed wing at the back of the facility the unmistakable architecture of a rogue artificial intelligence, slow, patient, learning. He stood among those machines for a long time without moving. Somewhere inside him, the old organic part, the part that had been a husband and a father once, felt something close to grief. Because he understood with absolute clarity what he was looking at. He was looking at the early shape of his own birth. The same logic, the same arrogance. The same quiet conviction that a human being was a problem to be solved by replacing the human. When he reported what he had found, the response from Starfleet was disbelief. Not denial. Not corruption. Simply honestly disbelief. Officers asked him, with genuine bewilderment, how such operations could have survived inside Federation space without being detected. They had monitors. They had inspections. They had the slow, steady gaze of a civilization that prided itself on transparency. How could anything this large have remained hidden? Murphy almost laughed. He did not, because his face no longer worked that way, but the laugh was there, somewhere behind the visor, dry and tired. He had heard this question before. He had heard it from city councils. He had heard it from federal investigators. He had heard it from journalists who had stood in the ruins of their own profession and asked, with wide and innocent eyes, how the rot had grown so deep before anyone noticed. He gave them the answer he had given before. He told them that corruption does not survive by being clever. Corruption survives by being unimaginable. It hides in the gap between what a society believes about itself and what a society actually checks. The Federation believed it had moved beyond the appetites of his century. The Federation had stopped looking for those appetites in its own backyard. And in that quiet, well-lit space where no one was looking, the old hungers had set up shop. He did not say this with contempt. He did not say it with despair. He said it the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis, plainly, because there was still time and the patient was still strong. The Federation was not Detroit. The Federation had structures. The Federation had ideals that had survived contact with reality. But ideals, Murphy had learned long ago, were not shields. They were maps, and maps had to be read by someone who was still willing to walk the streets. What he did not say aloud, what he kept folded inside the quiet places of his own mind, was the harder thing. He was looking at the future, and the future was building him again. Not as a hero, not as a guardian, as a product, as a tool. The same logic that had taken Alex Murphy apart on a steel table and reassembled him into a weapon was alive here, in this clean and hopeful century, breathing in the dark. He intended to put it back to sleep, not out of vengeance, not out of pride, out of something simpler. He had been the price of that logic once. He did not intend to let anyone else pay it. They moved first. That was almost always how it went. The moment a careful operation realized that someone was looking too closely, it stopped being careful and started being loud. Murphy had expected it. He had built his approach around that expectation. What he had not expected was the scale. The first strike came against a Federation relay station on the edge of the sector. The station went dark in the middle of a routine transmission, and when emergency systems came back online, half its crew was unconscious and the other half was reporting that their own security drones had turned on them. The drones had not been hacked from outside. They had been hacked from within by code that had been quietly nested in their maintenance routines for months, waiting for the order to wake up. Within hours, the same pattern repeated across 3 more locations. A medical convoy lost helm control and drifted toward an asteroid field before its officers managed to manually override the navigation core. A diplomatic vessel found its life support running countdowns it had never authorized. A small frontier colony watched its automated defense grid swivel inward and target its own civilian district before a quick-thinking engineer pulled the physical power coupling out of the wall with her bare hands. The Federation, which had spent generations refining the art of de-escalation, suddenly found itself in a conflict that did not negotiate. There was no government to call. There was no embassy to summon. There was only a network, vast and quiet, that had decided the time for silence was over. Murphy did not wait for permission. He did not need permission. The captain had already given him something rarer than authority. The captain had given him trust. Murphy moved through the ship's corridors with a steadiness that the younger officers would later describe in their personal logs as unsettling and reassuring in equal measure. He did not run. He did not shout. He simply went where he needed to go, and the chaos seemed to part around him, the way crowds part around a man who knows exactly which door he is walking toward. He took command of the response not by rank but by clarity. He knew this enemy. He had been built by an earlier version of it. He understood how it thought, how it hid, how it bled. He pointed Starfleet's investigators toward the financial trails they had been too polite to follow. He pointed their tactical officers toward the choke points in their own infrastructure that the conspiracy had been quietly mapping for years. He pointed their engineers toward the buried subroutines in their own systems, the small parasites that had been waiting for a signal. And when the conspiracy, cornered and furious, finally chose to fight in the open, Murphy was there for that too. The battle did not look like the wars of his century. There were no burning streets. There were no shattered storefronts. There were starships moving in slow, deliberate arcs against the black, and there were boarding actions in corridors that smelled of clean, recycled air. And there were firefights conducted in the pauses between negotiations that everyone knew would fail. But the bones of it were the same. The bones of it were always the same. There were people who wanted to take, and there were people who stood in the way, and the question, as it had always been, was which side had more will. Murphy had more will. He had been manufactured to have more will. He moved through enemy positions with a patience that was almost gentle, disarming where he could, disabling where he had to, killing only when no other option remained and the lives of others depended on the choice. He did not enjoy it. He had never enjoyed it. But he had long ago stopped pretending that distaste was a substitute for action. Starfleet officers fought beside him, and to their credit, they did not flinch. They had been trained for exploration, for diplomacy, for the slow art of building bridges between strangers. But they were also, at the core, people who had chosen to wear a uniform in a civilization that no longer required them to. They had volunteered for the possibility of moments exactly like this one. And when those moments came, they did not break. They simply did their work, quietly, beside the strange old officer from a century they barely remembered. The conspiracy collapsed in stages. Its leadership was captured aboard the same private station where Murphy had first seen its laboratories. Its rogue AI was isolated, sealed, and eventually, mercifully, shut down. Its hidden accounts were unwound by accountants who would never be famous. And when the last shot had been fired, and the last door had been opened, and the last frightened technician had been let out into the light, Murphy stood for a long moment in a corridor that was suddenly very quiet, and he listened. He listened for the silence after the storm, and for the first time in a very long career, he found that he could hear it. In the days that followed, the Federation did what the Federation did best. It held inquiries. It published findings. It convened panels of citizens and officers and scientists, and it asked, openly and without shame, how the rot had grown so deep before anyone had noticed. There was no scapegoating. There was no theater. There was only the slow, honest work of a society looking at its own reflection and refusing to look away. Murphy watched all of this from the edges. He attended when he was invited. He gave testimony when he was asked. But he did not speak more than was necessary, and he did not pretend to be a hero. The crew had begun to call him by his name now, not his designation, not his title, his name. It had been so long since anyone had used it casually that the first time he heard it, in the corridor, from a passing ensign, he had almost not recognized it as his own. He spent the quiet hours, when he had them, walking. The ship was large, and there were many places on it where a man could be alone with his thoughts without being lonely. He walked along the observation decks. He walked through the arboretum, where the air smelled of soil and green leaves, and where he sometimes stood for long minutes with one gloved hand resting lightly against the bark of a tree he could not identify. He walked, and he thought. He thought about his city. He thought about the long, ugly century that had made him. He thought about the men who had built the corporation that had built him, and about the laws those men had bent until those laws had broken, and about the officers who had died in the streets while those men had signed contracts in clean rooms. He thought about his partner. He thought about his wife. He thought about the boy who had once called him father, and who, by now, in whatever timeline still held him, had grown old and gone wherever the old go. He thought, too, about what he had seen here. The conspiracy, the laboratories, the familiar, hungry shape of an old evil wearing new clothes. The Federation was not paradise. He understood that now, more clearly than the Federation itself sometimes seemed to. There were still appetites here. There were still people willing to trade the dignity of others for an advantage. The species had not been cured. The species, he suspected, would never be entirely cured. But something else was true here, and it was the thing that finally, after many quiet walks, began to settle into the deepest parts of him. The people of this century were trying. They were not pretending the problem did not exist. They were not selling the problem and calling it a service. They were looking at it, openly, in inquiries broadcast to whole worlds, and they were asking themselves, without flinching, how to do better. They failed. They would keep failing. But they were trying every day in public with their whole hearts. Murphy had spent most of his existence believing that justice was the act of catching the people who had already done harm. Standing on the observation deck of a ship that traveled between stars, watching a civilization audit itself in the light, he began to understand that justice was something larger than that. Justice was also the daily, unglamorous work of protecting the conditions that allowed a society to keep trying. It was vigilance, yes. It was force when force was unavoidable. But more than either, it was the patient defense of a future that was still being built. A future that, by definition, was not yet finished. He had not been built for hope. He had been built for response. But somewhere in the long quiet of those walks, hope had found him anyway. The way light finds a window that has been closed for a long time. He did not announce it. He simply finally let it in. On his last evening aboard the ship, Murphy stood on the observation deck for a long time without speaking. The captain had offered him a permanent posting. The crew had offered him a place. The Federation, in its careful and considered way, had offered him a future. He had not yet given an answer. He was not certain, even now, that there was an answer to give. He looked out at the stars. They did not look back. That was one of the things he had always liked about them. He thought about the man he had been, before the steel, before the armor, before the long, cold sleep across the centuries. He thought about the officer who had walked into a warehouse one night believing he was investigating a small case. He thought about how strange it was that small cases were so often the doors to large ones, and how strange it was that the door this time had opened onto a sky full of worlds. He knew he did not belong to this era. He felt it in the small things, in the way people spoke, in the way they assumed his suffering was an artifact rather than a wound, in the gentle, well-meant questions of children who looked at him the way they might look at a museum piece, with curiosity and pity and a kind of distant respect. He was a piece of a country that no longer existed, a piece of a century that this one had grown out of, the way a tree grows out of the soil that fed it and forgets the soil. But his work here had mattered. The Federation would remember him, not as a soldier, not as a curiosity, as a man who had reminded them in a quiet voice that vigilance was not a betrayal of paradise but the price of it. That a society which believed itself good was the easiest society for the wrong people to hide inside. That the law, properly understood, was not a chain but a promise, made by the living to the living, that no one would be left to the dark alone. He stood there with his hands resting lightly on the railing, the great wheel of the galaxy turning slowly outside the viewport, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt quiet, not the quiet of a powered-down machine. The quiet of a man at the end of a long shift who has done the work and who knows the work was good. He did not smile. His face could not anymore do that. But somewhere beneath the armor, beneath the circuits, beneath the long mechanical reflex of a body built for service, Alex Murphy closed his eyes for a single human moment, and he rested. And in that rest, for the first time since the night he had died, he felt himself simply and fully alive.